What really happened to Hans Frank in his last 11 minutes on the gallows? The most awaited execution at Nuremberg. In the cold, grey morning of the 16th of October, 1946, in the city of Nuremberg, a moment unfolded that the world had been waiting for. Behind the walls of a guarded prison, one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted men, Hans Michael Frank, prepared to face the gallows. To many, he was not just another Nazi official. He was the Butcher of Poland, a man whose signature had condemned millions to suffering and death. Frank's journey from a privileged childhood to the top ranks of the Nazi regime had been marked by ambition, cunning, and a chilling loyalty to Hitler's vision. But now, after 10 relentless months of the most famous war crimes trial in history, that loyalty had brought him here to a wooden platform where the rope waited. 12 of the 21 defendants in the first Nuremberg trial had been sentenced to die. They were among the most powerful military, political, and economic figures of the Third Reich. Their crimes had been laid bare. Crimes against humanity, orchestrated oppression, and industrial-scale slaughter. Frank's role was undeniable. As Governor-General of occupied Poland, he presided over a territory that became the very heart of the Holocaust. And yet, in these final moments, something unexpected would emerge: a strange smile, a calm acceptance, and words that would surprise even those who despised him most. Before we witness those final, agonizing minutes on the gallows, we must understand how Hans Frank became the man who ruled Poland with an iron fist, and how he ended up paying the ultimate price for it. From privilege to radicalism, Hans Michael Frank was born on May 23, 1900, in Karls, then part of the German Empire. He was the second of 3 children in a family that carried both wealth and status. His father, Karl Frank, was a successful lawyer, while his mother, Magdalena, was the daughter of a prosperous banker. On the surface, it was an upbringing that promised comfort and opportunity, but at the age of 10, that promise was shattered. Magdalena left the family to live with a lover in Prague, a scandalous move that deeply wounded young Hans. The abandonment would haunt him, shaping a boy who craved control and authority in a world that had once felt secure. He grew up in Munich and attended the prestigious Maximilians Gymnasium. At 17, with World War I still raging, he enlisted in the German army. Yet, fate kept him from the front lines, and when the war ended in November 1918, Germany was in chaos. Revolution spread through the streets, and Frank, like many disillusioned young men, found a new identity in the Freikorps, paramilitary units made up of hardened veterans. In the Freikorps, Frank helped crush the Bavarian Soviet Republic, a short-lived socialist government in his region. It was a bloody initiation into politics, and it set him on a path toward the far-right extremism that would define his life. Soon, he became involved with the Tula Society, a secretive, occult-influenced group that would play a key role in the birth of the German Workers' Party, DAP. In 1919, he joined the DAP, which, just months later, would transform into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. But Frank was not yet in Hitler's inner circle. It wasn't until September 1923 that he joined the SA, the infamous Brown Shirts. That November, the Nazis made their first bold move to seize power. The Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup attempt aimed at overthrowing the German government. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed in the confrontation. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served only 8 months. Frank fled to Italy during the crackdown, mastering the Italian language before returning to Munich in 1924, when charges against him were dropped. A calculated marriage and a rising star. On the 2nd of April, 1925, Hans Frank married Brigitte Herbst, a stenographer for the Bavarian State Chamber. She was ambitious, eager to secure her place in high society before turning 30. In Frank, she saw a young lawyer from a wealthy family, a man who could provide the life she desired. But the marriage was far from idyllic. Frank struggled to assert himself, while Brigitte often reminded him of her sacrifice. "Hans, I gave you 5 children. Between 1927 and 1939, she would indeed bear him 5, including their son, Nicholas Frank, who would one day become one of his harshest critics. By 1929, Adolf Hitler himself appointed Frank as his personal legal advisor and head of the Nazi Party's legal department. Frank's sharp legal mind and fanatical loyalty made him a powerful ally. Over the years, he represented the party in over 2,400 cases, often clashing with other lawyers. But his work was crucial. It helped build the legal scaffolding for the Nazi rise to power. The 1,930 elections marked a turning point. The Nazis surged to 107 seats in the Reichstag, and Frank became a member of parliament. When Hitler seized the chancellorship in January 1933, Frank's influence grew rapidly. In April, he was named Minister of Justice for Bavaria, and by 1934, he was a Reich minister without portfolio and one of the top legal officials in the Nazi hierarchy. Yet even within the ruthless Nazi system, Frank occasionally clashed with the regime's methods. He opposed extrajudicial killings not out of compassion, but because he believed they weakened the appearance of law and order. Still, his loyalty to the party's racial ideology never wavered. By the late 1932, Frank's position was secure, and his connections stretched beyond Germany's borders. He met Mussolini in 1936 and personally delivered Hitler's invitation for the Italian dictator to visit Germany. But events in November 1938, the night of broken glass, when Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked en masse, revealed the brutal future the Nazis envisioned. Brigitte Frank, despite once having Jewish business contacts, showed no sympathy for those begging for help. Within a year, the world would be at war, and Hans Frank's role in history would darken beyond all redemption. The crown of power and the shadow beneath it. On the 1st of September, 1939, the German war machine roared across the Polish border, unleashing a blitzkrieg that stunned the world. Just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. By the end of the month, Poland had been carved in two, its sovereignty erased in a matter of weeks. In October 1939, Adolf Hitler appointed Hans Frank as Governor General of the newly created General Gouvernement, the central portion of occupied Poland. Hitler saw him as a man who would enforce Nazi policy without causing political headaches. When Frank returned to his villa in Berlin to tell Brigitte the news, his words were chilling. "Brigitte, you will be the Queen of Poland." To Frank, this was no mere administrative post. It was a colonial governorship, a chance to reshape Poland into a resource colony of the Reich. He openly declared that Poles should be reduced to slaves of the German Empire, a kingdom in chains. Yet, despite his lofty title, Frank quickly discovered that his authority was far from absolute. While he was the highest civilian official in the general government, the SS and police forces commanded by Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich often ignored him entirely. They controlled the machinery of racial policy, running operations without even informing him. When Frank once dared question Himmler about a new concentration camp being built in Poland, he received a curt, cutting reply, "That's none of your business." Hitler's vision for the general government was grim. It would be a dumping ground for undesirable populations, a source of endless slave labor, and the central killing ground for Europe's Jews. The territory held about 12 million people, including roughly 1.5 million Jews, a number that grew to over 4 million when Eastern Galicia was annexed in 1941. Frank tried to assert his authority, but the SS operated as an untouchable state within a state. His disputes with Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, the head of the SS in Poland, became so bitter that in 1942, Hitler stripped Frank of nearly all his positions in Germany. He remained Governor General in name, but his power was steadily hollowed out. The war turns darker. In the first 2 years of the war, the German military seemed unstoppable. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and France all fell in quick succession. But Britain stood defiant, and by late 1941, the Nazi high command turned its eyes eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, initially brought staggering gains. German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad, but the brutal Russian winter brought the advance to a halt. It was during this turning point that the Nazi regime began accelerating its most horrific policy, the annihilation of the Jewish people. Before 1939, the goal had been forced emigration, but with millions of Jews now under Nazi control in occupied Poland, emigration was no longer an option. Instead, a darker, final plan emerged. By the summer of 1941, SS Einsatzgruppen units were slaughtering entire Jewish communities behind the front lines in the Soviet Union. At the same time, the first extermination centers were being prepared in occupied Poland. Half of Europe's Jewish population, those already living under Nazi control, were to be identified, rounded up, deported, and murdered. This plan was formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. Among those present was Joseph Bühler, Frank's Secretary of State and right-hand man. The general government would become the central stage of the Holocaust. Poland, the killing ground of Europe. 6 major extermination camps were created for the sole purpose of mass murder, 4 of them within Frank's territory: Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Belzec. Auschwitz-Birkenau lay just beyond the general government's border, and Chelmno stood further west. The scale of death was staggering. Treblinka alone claimed some 800,000 lives, Belzec 600,000, Sobibor 250,000, Majdanek at least 80,000. When Auschwitz is included, the number of Jews murdered in and around the general government surpasses 3 million. The SS administered these camps independently, but Frank's civil administration played an enabling role. His offices helped identify and register Jews, confiscate their property, and coordinate their deportations. Many victims were dead within hours of arrival, suffocated in gas chambers before their bodies were burned in crematoria. Even before the final solution was fully in place, Frank's administration implemented policies designed to kill. Food rations for Jews were cut to starvation levels as little as 200 calories per day. Heating fuel was withheld in winter. Death by hunger and exposure became state policy. The Warsaw Ghetto life behind the wall. Nowhere was the cruelty more concentrated than in Warsaw. Before the war, the city had a vast Jewish population, with neighborhoods where Jews made up 80–90% of residents. After the German invasion, more Jews fled there for refuge, only to find themselves trapped. By early 1940, Frank's administration ordered the construction of a wall around the Jewish district. In November, the Warsaw Ghetto was officially established a prison for over 400,000 souls. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Starvation and disease claimed some 100,000 lives before mass deportations began in 1942. From the summer to the autumn of that year, more than 250,000 people were herded onto trains to Treblinka. Many still didn't know their destination was death. But as the truth emerged, those who remained resolved to resist. Led by 4-year-old Mordechai Anielewicz, the Jewish Combat Organization prepared for a final stand. In January 1943, when German forces returned to liquidate the ghetto, fighters ambushed them, sparking the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. For 3 months, about 1,000 Jewish fighters defied the might of the Nazi war machine until the 19th of April, 1943, when thousands of Waffen-SS troops crushed the resistance. The remaining 35,000 survivors were deported to extermination camps. This was Frank's Poland, a place where human life was reduced to a ledger of resources, labor, and bodies to be disposed of. The tide turns. The brutality in occupied Poland unfolded in step with the changing fortunes of the Nazi war effort. After the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943, the Soviet Red Army began pushing the Germans back. At the same time, the United States had entered the war, bringing a flood of manpower and resources to the Allied side. Victories in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, and the liberation of France in 1944 left Hitler's empire shrinking on all fronts. In Poland, the resistance movement grew bolder. Supported by the Polish government in exile in London and supplied increasingly by the Soviets, the underground began assassinating German officials in the general government. Late in 1943, inspired by the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague the previous year, the Polish secret state plotted to kill Frank himself. An attempt on the Butcher of Poland. On the night of the 29th of January, 1944, as Frank traveled by train from Krakow to Lviv, a bomb exploded beneath his carriage near the town of Dębica. The blast tore off the rear axle of his car and derailed the train. Miraculously, Frank emerged unscathed. By the very next day, he was flying to his destination under brutal winter skies. In retaliation, Polish prisoners were executed on his orders, and security around him was tightened. But this attempt foreshadowed a larger storm. By the spring of 1944, the Polish resistance was preparing for a massive uprising. The plan was to strike in Warsaw as the Red Army approached from the east, forcing the Germans to fight on 2 fronts and hastening liberation. The Warsaw Uprising. On the 1st of August, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. For 63 days, Polish fighters battled the German occupiers street by street, But the Western Allies could offer little more than airdropped supplies, and the Soviet forces poised just across the Vistula River held back, allowing the Germans to crush the rebellion. By the time the uprising ended, Warsaw was in ruins, its surviving population deported or massacred. For Frank, the loss of Warsaw was both a symbolic and practical disaster. The capital of his domain was now a smoldering wasteland. The general government's collapse was only a matter of time. Flight from Krakow. In the bitter winter of January 1945, with Soviet forces surging westward, Krakow, the seat of Frank's rule, was surrounded. On the 17th of January, air raid sirens wailed over the city as word came that Russian tanks had breached the outer defenses. Brigitte and the children had already fled the month before. Frank gathered his top administrators and fled in a convoy just before noon. When Soviet troops entered Krakow the next day, they found Frank's offices littered with documents and empty liquor bottles, evidence of a hasty, chaotic retreat. The Nazis had not even bothered to destroy the paperwork detailing years of oppression and exploitation. Frank headed not for Berlin, but for Bavaria, the landscape of his early political career. By early February 1945, he was in the south, offering his services to the collapsing Reich, but Hitler had little use for him. Stripped of his key position since 1942, and with the general government dissolved, Frank found himself a man with a title and no power. The end of the war. In early May 1945, as news spread that Hitler had committed suicide on the 30th of April and the Reich crumbled, Frank was hiding in southern Bavaria. On May 4th, American troops captured him in the town of Tegernsee. These soldiers had liberated Dachau just 5 days earlier and were in no mood for mercy. As they marched him through a gauntlet of jeering soldiers, Frank, unable to bear the humiliation, attempted suicide. When that failed, he tried again 2 days later, slitting his wrist, but survived. He would later explain, "I tried to commit suicide because I sacrificed everything for Hitler, and that man we sacrificed everything for left us alone." His son Nicholas would put it more bluntly. Frank feared being treated the way he himself had treated others. The trial of the butcher. With the war over, Hans Frank became one of the most infamous prisoners in history. He was among 21 high-ranking Nazi officials to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, the first and most famous of the post-war war crimes trials. His charges were monumental: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. At the outset, Frank made a startling admission. He expressed terrible guilt for the atrocities committed in occupied Poland. But his legal defense was built on denial and evasion. He claimed he had merely carried out necessary pacification measures, that police and SS units operated beyond his control, and that he had been unaware of the extermination camps. This defense collapsed under the weight of evidence. Witness testimony, captured German documents, and even statements from his own subordinates revealed the truth. Frank's administration had facilitated mass deportations, starvation policies, and the machinery of genocide. His own son, Nicholas Frank, would later state without hesitation that both his parents knew about the extermination of Jews. A strange spiritual turn. While awaiting judgment, Frank underwent a curious transformation. He converted to Roman Catholicism, claiming to have had a series of religious visions. He accused the Allies, especially the Soviets, of their own wartime atrocities, but he and architect Albert Speer were the only defendants to express any degree of remorse. Frank's words during the trial were remarkable for a man who had once seen himself as King of Poland. "I myself, speaking from the depths of my feelings and having lived through the 5 months of this trial, want to say that now, after having gained a full view of all the horrible atrocities that were committed, I am possessed by a profound sense of guilt. Those of us who are guilty must pay the price." The verdict. On the 1st of October, 1946, the tribunal found Hans Frank guilty on 2 counts, war crimes and crimes against humanity. The court declared him a conscious and willing participant in the use of terror in Poland, in the mass starvation of civilians, in the deportation of over 1 million Poles to Germany as slave laborers, and in a program that murdered at least 3 million Jews. Frank's response to his death sentence was stark. "Death by hanging, I deserved that and expected it. Hopefully." The gallows at Nuremberg. At dawn on the 16th of October, 1946, the executions began. U.S. Army Sergeant John C. Woods, the man tasked with carrying them out, had no known pre-war experience as a hangman. Many believed he deliberately botched the hangings to make them more painful. The drop was too short to break the neck, and several condemned men, including Frank, died slowly of strangulation, their convulsions lasting minutes. Frank was the fifth man to be led to the scaffold that day. Unlike the others, he entered the chamber with a faint, almost serene smile. His final words were unexpected. "I am grateful for the treatment received during my captivity, and I ask God to receive me with mercy." The trapdoor fell, but the drop was insufficient, and Frank's death was a grim spectacle, 11 long minutes of twitching and gasping before he was still. He was 46 years old. Afterward, his body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in the Isar River. Sergeant Woods later insisted he had done everything properly, and even declared that he was proud of his work. The forgotten details behind the butcher's fall. While Hans Frank's name is forever tied to the machinery of Nazi terror, certain details of his downfall remain less well known, details that reveal both the pettiness and contradictions of the man. When Soviet troops closed in on Krakow in January 1945, Frank's hasty escape left behind not only stacks of official documents, but also evidence of his personal habits. Empty liquor bottles scattered through the offices where his staff once ruled with an iron fist. It was a scene repeated across collapsing Nazi strongholds, the drunken retreat of men who once strutted through conquered cities. After his capture, Frank's wife, Brigitte, faced her own collapse. Once accustomed to wealth and influence, she now had to sell jewelry stolen from murdered Jews and paintings looted from Poland just to buy food. What remained was confiscated by the Allies, yet she still clung to the delusion that her husband might be freed, even hoping to have another child with him. One of the strangest connections during the Nuremberg Trials was Brigitte's interaction with Gaston Ullmann, a Jewish journalist covering the proceedings. Despite her past and her husband's crimes, she described him in a letter to Frank as Jewish, but I think he has a human heart. It was a chilling reminder of how selective and self-serving her perceptions were. The unlikely confessor. Inside his prison cell, Frank's religious conversion baffled many. Was it a sincere reckoning with guilt, or simply a desperate bid for redemption? Some Catholic priests who visited him believed his remorse was genuine. Others thought it a performance. What cannot be denied is that his words in those final months' confessions of guilt, appeals to God, stood in sharp contrast to the arrogance he had displayed for most of his political life. And yet, no amount of contrition could erase the record. Under his administration, millions were stripped of their rights, starved, deported, and murdered. He had helped create the legal framework that made mass killing possible, and then claimed surprise when the killing came. Legacy of infamy. Hans Frank's story did not end with his execution. His son, Niklas Frank, grew up to be one of his harshest public critics, writing books that condemned his father in the most unflinching terms. Niklas rejected any notion of honor in his father's actions, describing him as both a coward and a willing instrument of Hitler's genocidal policies. Today, historians see Frank as a case study in how educated, cultured men can commit atrocities not in a fit of rage, but in the methodical, bureaucratic coldness of an office administrator. He was not a battlefield butcher with blood on his hands. He was a desk-bound ruler whose orders killed millions. And when the rope finally tightened around his neck on that October morning, the long arc of justice bent toward one of its most public reckonings, a warning to dictators and war criminals that power can collapse overnight, and the gallows may be waiting. Justice at the gallows. The life and death of Hans Frank form one of the most striking arcs in the story of Nazi Germany, a man who rose from the comfort of privilege to the heights of political power, only to plunge into disgrace and execution. As Governor General of occupied Poland, he presided over one of the darkest chapters in human history, a reign that saw ghettos walled in, populations starved, and millions sent to their deaths in the extermination camps that scarred the landscape of Europe. In the end, the Nuremberg Trials were not just about punishing individuals, they were about setting a precedent that no one, no matter how high their position, is above the law of humanity. Frank's calm acceptance of his sentence could not erase the devastation he had overseen, nor could his late-in-life religious conversion undo the suffering inflicted under his rule. When the trapdoor fell on the 16th of October, 1946, it closed the chapter on a life steeped in complicity and cruelty, but the lessons it left behind endure. That law, when corrupted, can be wielded as a weapon of oppression, that intellect and education are no safeguards against moral collapse, and that justice, though sometimes slow, can reach even those who once seemed untouchable. Hans Frank's story is a grim reminder of how easily the machinery of government can be turned into a tool for mass destruction and how, in the end, the weight of history has a way of reclaiming the truth.